What happens when 30 men find themselves staring down an army 100 times their size? Most would call it suicide. Some would call it impossible. But on a frozen morning in December 1944, a small group of American soldiers proved that sometimes the most desperate situations create the most extraordinary outcomes. This is the story of how a single platoon, cut off from their unit, low on ammunition, and facing impossible odds, managed to achieve what military historians still debate as one of the most improbable defensive victories of World War II. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're bringing you the untold stories from the Second World War that you won't find in any textbook. And trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next in this unbelievable tale of survival and tactical genius. The snow fell heavy across the Ardennes forest in Belgium that December morning, creating a blanket of white that should have been peaceful, but instead masked one of the most desperate situations any soldier could face. Lieutenant James Hendricks stood at the edge of a small Belgian village called Rocherath, staring at the tree line with a feeling in his gut that something was terribly wrong. His platoon, part of the 99th Infantry Division, had been holding this position for 3 days, but the radio had gone silent 6 hours ago, and the sounds of battle that had been constant for weeks had shifted in a way that made every experienced soldier nervous. Behind him, 29 men huddled in hastily reinforced positions around a destroyed farmhouse and a stone church that had become their impromptu fortress. These weren't elite commandos or especially trained assault troops. They were regular infantry, most of them draftees, who had seen their first combat less than 2 months earlier. Young men from farms in Iowa, factories in Detroit, and offices in New York who had been thrown into the hell of the Ardennes offensive with barely enough time to learn how to keep their rifles from freezing in the brutal winter cold. The date was December 18th, 1944, and what these 30 men didn't know was that they were about to become the forgotten heroes of what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge, facing down elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division in a confrontation that should have ended in minutes, but would instead last for 14 hours of continuous combat. Hendricks had received his last orders the previous evening, a crackling transmission telling him to hold the crossroads at all costs until reinforcements arrived. But as dawn broke and the radio remained silent, he realized with growing dread that something had gone catastrophically wrong with the American lines. The massive German offensive that had begun 2 days earlier had punched through Allied positions with shocking speed, and his platoon, which was supposed to be several miles behind friendly lines, was now isolated in enemy territory with no support, no way to retreat, and no idea that the nearest American forces were now more than 15 miles away. Private First Class Robert Chen was the first to see them. He had been on watch in the church bell tower, a position that gave him a clear view of the forest road leading into the village, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Through the morning mist and falling snow, a column of German soldiers was emerging from the trees, not a patrol or a reconnaissance unit, but what looked like an entire regiment moving in parade formation with tanks, half-tracks, and thousands of men stretching back into the forest as far as he could see. Chen grabbed the field telephone that connected him to the command post in the farmhouse below and cranked it frantically, his voice barely a whisper as he reported what was approaching. "Lieutenant, we've got company. Big company. I'm counting at least 50 vehicles and more infantry than I can count. There may be 15 minutes out and heading straight for us." In the farmhouse, Hendricks felt his stomach drop as he processed this information. His platoon had 30 men, 2 Browning machine guns, 1 bazooka with 3 rockets, rifles, grenades, and whatever ammunition they had managed to conserve over the past 3 days of sporadic fighting. Against what Chen was describing, they had about as much chance as a candle in a hurricane. The smart move, the move that any reasonable officer would make, was to order an immediate withdrawal, to slip away through the forest and try to reach American lines before the Germans discovered them. But Hendricks looked at the map spread across the farmhouse table and realized something that would define everything that followed. This village, this insignificant crossroads that probably didn't even appear on most military maps, controlled the only paved road for 5 miles that could support heavy armor in winter conditions. If the Germans took it unopposed, they would have a clear highway deeper into Allied territory, potentially threatening the entire defensive line that was already buckling under the massive offensive. The reinforcements he had been told to wait for weren't coming, he knew that now. But maybe, just maybe, if his platoon could delay the Germans here for even a few hours, it might buy enough time for other units to establish a defensive line further back. It was a slim hope, probably a futile hope, but it was something. And in that moment, Lieutenant James Hendricks made a decision that would either be remembered as heroic or suicidal, depending on whether any of them survived the next few hours. He gathered his squad leaders in the farmhouse kitchen, 5 non-commissioned officers who looked as exhausted and shell-shocked as every other man in the platoon. Sergeant Mike Torres, a pre-war regular who had fought in North Africa and Italy before being transferred to the new division. Corporal Eddie Sullivan, a former college football player from Boston who had a talent for improvising defensive positions. Corporal James Washington, a quiet man from Georgia who was the best shot in the platoon and commanded respect despite the racial tensions that existed even in combat units. Corporal Frank Kowalski, a mechanic from Chicago who could make anything work with wire, tape, and stubborn determination. And Corporal David Miller, the youngest squad leader at 22, who had been promoted 2 weeks earlier when his predecessor was killed. These 5 men and the soldiers under their command were about to be asked to do something that defied every principle of military logic, and Hendricks knew he had to be completely honest about what he was proposing. "Gentlemen, we have a situation," Hendricks began, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "There's a German regiment, probably 3,000 men with armor support, heading straight for this village. Our radio is dead, reinforcements aren't coming, and we're completely cut off. By any rational calculation, we should be running for our lives right now, and I won't blame any man who wants to try making it through the forest to friendly lines. But I need you to understand something. This road is the key to the entire sector. If the Germans take it without resistance, they'll be able to move armor and troops through here that could collapse whatever defensive line our guys are trying to establish. We can't stop them. We don't have the firepower or the men for that. But we might be able to slow them down, make them think they're facing a much larger force, force them to deploy and attack cautiously instead of just rolling through. If we can hold them for even a few hours, it might make the difference between an orderly withdrawal and a complete rout for our division." If you're enjoying this incredible story of courage against impossible odds, go ahead and smash that like button and drop a comment telling us what you would have done in Lieutenant Hendricks' position. Would you have ordered a retreat or stood and fought? Let us know below, and keep watching because what happens next is going to blow your mind with the tactical genius these ordinary soldiers displayed when faced with certain death. The silence in that farmhouse kitchen was heavy as the squad leaders absorbed what their lieutenant was proposing. They weren't fools. They knew exactly what holding this position meant. But they also understood the logic behind the decision. And more importantly, they understood the code that held combat units together. The unspoken agreement that sometimes soldiers have to do impossible things so that others might have a chance. Torres was the first to speak, his voice carrying the weight of experience that came from surviving 3 years of combat. "How long are we talking about, Lieutenant? What's the minimum time we need to buy?" Hendricks looked at his map again, doing calculations in his head based on German movement rates and the distance to where he hoped American lines were forming. 6 hours minimum. 8 would be better. 12 would be a miracle that might actually stabilize the entire sector. Sullivan let out a low whistle. 12 hours against a regiment with our 30 guys? Sir, I'm not questioning the order, but that's asking for something that's never been done. Hendricks nodded, acknowledging the reality of what he was asking. I know, Eddie. That's why I'm not making it an order. This has to be a choice. We take a vote right here, right now. Every man gets a say. We either try to hold this position, knowing we probably won't survive, or we scatter into the forest and try to save ourselves. No judgment either way. This is beyond what anyone should be asked to do. The vote was unanimous. Not because the men were suicidal or because they didn't understand the odds, but because in that moment they understood something fundamental about who they were and what they believed in. They were soldiers, yes, but more than that, they were a unit, a brotherhood forged in the shared misery and terror of combat, and the idea of abandoning their post while other Americans were fighting and dying nearby was simply unacceptable, regardless of the personal cost. Washington summed up what everyone was feeling when he said simply, "We ain't running, Lieutenant. We're infantrymen. We hold the line. That's what we do." And with those words, 30 men committed themselves to a defensive battle that would become legendary. A last stand that would be studied by military academies for decades to come, though their names would largely be forgotten by history until recently declassified documents revealed the full scope of what they accomplished.
The preparation time was brutally short. The Germans were less than 10 minutes away, and there was no time for elaborate defensive works or carefully planned fields of fire. What followed was organized chaos as the platoon transformed the village into a killing ground using nothing but infantry weapons, determination, and tactical creativity that would have impressed seasoned combat engineers. Hendricks divided his force into 3 defensive positions, each designed to create the illusion of a much larger defending force. The church became the primary strong point, with the 2 Browning machine guns positioned in the bell tower where Chen had spotted the German column, giving them overlapping fields of fire down the main road and into the village square. The stone walls of the church were thick enough to provide genuine protection against small arms fire and even some artillery fragments, and the elevated position gave the machine gunners a tactical advantage that multiplied their effectiveness. The farmhouse became the second position, with riflemen spread across the upper floor and basement, creating multiple firing positions that could engage targets from different angles and make it difficult for the Germans to identify where shots were coming from. Torres took command of this position with 12 men, the largest concentration of force, because it controlled the crossroads itself and would bear the brunt of any German assault. The third position was the most creative and the most dangerous. Sullivan led a squad of 8 men to positions scattered throughout the ruined buildings on the edge of the village, camouflaged positions that would remain hidden until the Germans were committed to the attack, then opened fire from unexpected angles, creating confusion and the impression of defenders everywhere. This was aggressive defense at its finest, using mobility and surprise to compensate for lack of numbers and firepower. Kowalski, the mechanic, proved his worth in those frantic minutes before contact. He had noticed a small fuel depot the Germans had abandoned during their retreat weeks earlier, several barrels of diesel and gasoline that had been left behind. Working with desperate speed, he and 3 other men rolled the barrels into positions along the main road, disguising them with snow and rubble, creating improvised explosive obstacles that could be detonated with tracer rounds if the Germans brought armor into the village. It was crude, dangerous, and violated probably a dozen regulations about handling fuel near combat operations, but it gave them one more tool in a toolbox that was already almost empty. Miller, the youngest squad leader, was given the bazooka and the 3 precious rockets that represented their only real anti-armor capability. His position was in a cellar with a narrow firing slit that looked directly down the main road, a one-shot position that would expose him the moment he fired, but that offered the best chance of taking out a tank if the Germans decided to lead with armor.
Washington took his rifle and the platoon's only sniper scope to a position in the attic of a building 50 yards from the main defensive line. His job wasn't to hold ground, but to create chaos, to take carefully aimed shots at German officers and NCOs to slow down their decision-making and make them cautious. It was a suicide mission in many ways, isolated and vulnerable, but Washington had volunteered for it with the calm certainty of a man who understood exactly what needed to be done and was willing to pay the price. The remaining men were distributed as runners and reserves, ready to reinforce whatever position came under the heaviest pressure or to replace casualties that everyone knew were inevitable. Hendricks established his command post in the church basement, where he could communicate with all 3 positions using field telephones and where he had a clear view of the main approaches through a narrow cellar window. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't sophisticated, but it was a defensive plan that maximized their limited resources and created multiple problems for an attacking force. At exactly 0930 hours, the first German troops entered the village. They came cautiously at first, a forward scout element of maybe 20 men, moving in standard patrol formation, weapons ready, but not expecting serious resistance in what their map showed as a minor crossroads village that should have been undefended. What happened in the next 90 seconds would set the tone for everything that followed and would save countless American lives through sheer psychological impact. Hendricks had given strict orders that no one was to fire until he gave the signal, no matter how tempting the targets became. He waited until the German scouts were completely committed, spread out across the village square with no cover, their officer clearly visible directing them forward. Then he blew a whistle, one short blast that pierced the morning air, and 30 American rifles and 2 machine guns opened fire simultaneously from multiple directions. The effect was devastating, not just physically, but psychologically. The German scouts were cut down in seconds, caught in a crossfire they couldn't escape or even identify the source of in the confusion of initial contact. But more importantly, the volume and coordination of fire created the impression of a much larger defending force, a company at minimum, possibly a battalion, firing from prepared positions with clear fields of fire and disciplined fire control. The German officer, in the split second before he was killed by a shot from Washington's sniper position, must have realized he had walked into a well-defended position that his intelligence had completely failed to identify. The survivors of that initial contact, less than half of the scouts who had entered the village, retreated in disarray, running back down the road toward their main column, and Hendricks allowed himself a grim smile because he knew exactly what would happen next. The Germans, thinking they had encountered a significant defensive position, would stop, deploy, bring up artillery and armor, and conduct a careful, methodical assault instead of the rapid advance they had been executing. Every minute they spent preparing to attack was another minute his platoon had bought for the American forces trying to establish a defensive line elsewhere. If you enjoyed this portion of Hendricks' story, you won't want to miss the rest of this incredible tale. The lull after the initial contact lasted exactly 18 minutes, and the platoon used every second of it. The machine gunners adjusted their position slightly, creating new firing ports so they wouldn't be firing from the exact same location twice. The riflemen redistributed ammunition, making sure every position had equal shares of the dwindling supply. Kowalski checked and rechecked the fuel barrels, making sure they would ignite when hit by tracer rounds. Washington repositioned to a new sniper hide, knowing the Germans would target his previous location with artillery once the real attack began. And Hendricks moved between positions, offering quiet words of encouragement,
making sure every man understood the plan and knew that their survival depended on fire discipline, coordination, and making the Germans believe they were facing a much larger force than they actually were. The German response was exactly what Hendricks had hoped for and feared simultaneously. Artillery shells began to fall on the village, a methodical bombardment that walked across the defensive positions in a textbook preparatory barrage. The Americans huddled in their positions, enduring the earth-shaking impacts, the shower of stone and wood fragments, the deafening noise that made thought impossible and turned the world into a nightmare of smoke and dust. The church took several direct hits, and for a moment Hendricks feared they had lost the machine gun position, but Torres's voice came through on the field telephone, shaken but determined, reporting 2 wounded but both guns still operational. The barrage lasted 12 minutes, an eternity for the men enduring it, then lifted abruptly as the German infantry began their assault. They came in force this time, not scouts but assault troops, several hundred men advancing in waves with tank support, 2 Panzer IVs rolling down the main road with infantry following close behind for protection against any anti-tank weapons. It was a sight that should have broken the will of any defender outnumbered 10-1. But Hendricks had prepared his men for exactly this moment. He let them come, let them commit to the attack, let the tanks roll into the village square past the first set of disguised fuel barrels. Then Miller, in his cellar position, fired the bazooka at point-blank range. The rocket hit the lead tank on its thinner side armor and penetrated, and the Panzer exploded in a fireball that sent the accompanying infantry diving for cover. Before the Germans could recover, tracer rounds from the machine gun positions struck the fuel barrels, and the improvised explosives detonated in a chain reaction that turned the village square into an inferno. The second tank, caught behind the burning wreck of the first and surrounded by flames from the fuel barrels, did exactly what Hendricks had gambled it would do. It reversed rapidly, backing down the narrow road in a panic. And in its haste to escape the kill zone, it threw a track on the uneven cobblestones and became immobilized, blocking the road completely and preventing any other armor from entering the village. The German infantry, having just watched 2 tanks taken out in less than 30 seconds, went to ground, taking cover in ditches and behind walls, no longer advancing but simply trying to survive. For the next 40 minutes, the battle settled into a deadly exchange of fire. Germans trying to identify and suppress the American positions, Americans firing from multiple locations and constantly shifting to avoid return fire, both sides taking casualties in a grinding attritional fight that neither could really afford, but that favored the defenders as long as ammunition held out.
Washington proved his worth during this phase, using his sniper rifle to devastating psychological effect. He didn't try for high rates of fire or suppressive effects. Instead, he took careful, deliberate shots at German officers and NCOs, the men trying to organize the assault, coordinate fire teams, direct their soldiers forward. Every time a German leader stood up to give orders or rally his troops, Washington's rifle would crack and another body would fall. The effect on German morale was profound, as the attacking troops realized that their commanders were being systematically eliminated by what must be a highly skilled sniper or possibly multiple snipers, another factor that contributed to their assessment that they were facing a much larger and more professional force than they actually were. By the time Washington was finally forced to relocate after German machine gun fire began chewing apart his position, he had fired 23 shots and, by his own conservative estimate, had eliminated at least 15 German soldiers, including 3 officers and 2 squad leaders. The Germans pulled back to regroup at approximately 1100 hours, and Hendricks conducted a hasty assessment of his situation. 3 men were dead, killed during the artillery barrage and the subsequent firefight. 7 more were wounded, ranging from minor shrapnel injuries to 1 man with a serious chest wound who was being kept alive through sheer determination and the rudimentary first aid their medic could provide with limited supplies. They had expended nearly 40% of their rifle ammunition, both machine guns were down to less than half their ammunition load, and Miller had fired 2 of their 3 bazooka rockets, leaving them with 1 shot against any future armor. On the positive side, they had held for nearly 2 hours, killed an estimated 80 to 100 German soldiers, destroyed 2 tanks, and forced the Germans to treat this as a major defensive position requiring a full regimental assault. The crossroads remained in American hands, and every minute they continued to hold was another minute bought for their comrades elsewhere. The second German assault came at noon, and it was clear the enemy commander had decided to end this fight quickly with overwhelming force. This time they brought mortars, setting up a sustained barrage that fell continuously on the American positions while infantry advanced under cover of the explosions. They also learned from their mistake with the tanks, sending infantry assault teams forward to clear the buildings methodically instead of trying to push armor into the kill zone. It was professional, competent assault tactics, exactly the kind of coordinated attack that should have overrun the position in minutes, and it very nearly succeeded. The farmhouse position was nearly overrun when a German squad fought their way to the ground floor, and Torres had to organize a desperate counterattack with grenades and close-quarters fighting that left 2 more Americans dead but cleared the building. Sullivan's scattered positions on the village edge were forced to fall back to the main line as German numbers simply overwhelmed their ability to defend isolated positions. The church machine guns fell silent for nearly 5 minutes when both crews were forced to take cover from concentrated mortar fire, and in that gap, German troops advanced into the village square. For a moment, it looked like the defense would collapse, like the odds had finally caught up with the impossible gamble Hendricks had taken. German soldiers were in the village now, not just on the approaches but inside the defensive perimeter. And the Americans were running low on everything except courage. But in that desperate moment, something remarkable happened, something that military historians still study as an example of small unit cohesion under impossible stress. Without orders, without coordination, simply responding to the crisis they all recognized, the American soldiers began fighting as individual cells of resistance, each man becoming his own defensive position, using every trick of close-quarters combat they had ever learned or imagined. Private Tommy Chen, who had started the day as an observer in the church tower, was now fighting with a rifle, a pistol, and a trench knife in the smoke-filled rooms of the church basement. Corporal Washington had exhausted his sniper ammunition, but had picked up a German MP-40 submachine gun from a dead soldier and was using it to defend the church entrance. Miller, having fired his last bazooka rocket at a German half-track and watched it miss, was now throwing grenades from his cellar position, each explosion buying a few more seconds of survival. Hendricks himself was no longer directing the battle from his command post, but was fighting alongside Torres in the farmhouse, both men firing their rifles at German soldiers who were sometimes less than 20 feet away in the smoke and chaos of close-quarters combat. The battle had devolved into something primal, beyond tactics or strategy, becoming simply a test of will between men who refused to surrender and men who refused to retreat. And somehow, impossibly, the Americans held. The Germans, having suffered catastrophic casualties in what they had thought would be a quick assault, pulled back again at 12:30 hours, and the village fell silent except for the moans of wounded men from both sides and the crackle of fires still burning from the earlier fuel barrel explosions. Hendricks counted his remaining force and felt despair wash over him despite their success. He had 16 men still capable of fighting, ammunition for maybe one more serious engagement, and no idea how much longer they could possibly hold against an enemy that seemed to have inexhaustible numbers. The third German assault began at 1400 hours, and it came with a new level of determination that suggested their commander was now taking the fight personally. Artillery and mortar fire increased to a sustained barrage that seemed designed to simply pulverize the village and everyone in it, regardless of casualties or ammunition expenditure. German infantry advanced behind the barrage, not in waves this time, but in a sustained push, accepting casualties but continuing forward with the grim determination of soldiers who had been ordered to take an objective regardless of cost. They brought up anti-tank guns to systematically destroy buildings, firing at point-blank range to collapse walls and eliminate defensive positions one at a time. It was brutal, effective tactics that should have succeeded, and for the first time since the battle began, Hendricks seriously considered surrender as a way to save the lives of his remaining men. But surrender wasn't an option, not because of pride or stubbornness, but because in the chaotic close-quarters fighting, both sides had crossed lines that made quarter unlikely. German soldiers shot Americans who were trying to surrender in the heat of battle. Americans shot Germans who were trying to surrender, not from cruelty, but from the fog of war and the adrenaline-fueled confusion of men fighting for their lives at arm's length. This had become the kind of fight where the only way out was victory or death, and everyone involved understood that reality. So they fought on, Americans and Germans locked in a death struggle over a crossroads village that had been insignificant 24 hours earlier, but had now become a matter of unit pride and military necessity for both sides. The church finally fell at 1500 hours when sustained artillery fire collapsed the bell tower, forcing the machine gun crews to abandon their positions and fall back to the church basement with their weapons. The farmhouse was on fire by 1530 hours, flames spreading through the upper floors and forcing Torres and his remaining men to fight from ground-level positions that offered little protection from German fire. Sullivan was dead, killed by a mortar blast that caught him in the open while he was trying to reposition his squad. Kowalski was badly wounded, barely conscious, but still directing two other men in defending a corner of the church courtyard. Washington had been out of ammunition for his weapons for 30 minutes and was now fighting with captured German rifles and ammunition, a ghost moving through the ruins of the village, taking shots wherever he could find targets. The Americans were down to their last reserves of everything: ammunition, medical supplies, food, water, and most critically, hope. They had held for more than 5 hours, far longer than anyone had thought possible, bought precious time with their blood and courage. But it couldn't last forever, and everyone knew the end was coming soon. At 1600 hours, something unexpected happened that would change everything. Through the smoke and noise of battle, Hendricks heard a sound that made his heart leap with hope he didn't dare believe in. Aircraft engines. American aircraft engines. The distinctive roar of P-47 Thunderbolts that every American soldier learned to recognize and love. He risked exposure to look up through a shell hole in the church roof, and there they were, 4 fighter bombers circling overhead, and as he watched, they rolled into attack runs on the German positions outside the village. Bombs and rockets tore into the German assembly areas, followed by strafing runs that sent German soldiers scrambling for cover. The assault that had been building for another push into the village faltered and then collapsed as the Germans, having no air defense at this level, were forced to pull back to avoid the aerial attack. The P-47s made 3 passes, expending all their ordnance on the German positions, and then waggled their wings in salute before turning south toward their base. It wasn't rescue, not yet, but it was proof that someone knew they were here, that their stand hadn't been completely forgotten. What Hendricks didn't know, couldn't have known in the isolation of his battle, was that his platoon's desperate defense had created ripples far beyond the village itself. The German regiment that had been delayed for hours at this insignificant crossroads was supposed to be spearheading the drive toward Liège, maintaining the momentum of the Ardennes offensive.
Their absence from the main axis of advance at a critical time had created a gap in the German assault that allowed American forces to establish defensive positions that would eventually help contain the offensive. The repeated radio reports of heavy resistance at Rockrath, sent by the frustrated German commander to explain his lack of progress, had drawn attention from American intelligence officers who realized that someone was still fighting behind German lines. The airstrike Hendricks had just witnessed was the first response, a desperate attempt to support whoever was holding that position, but it wasn't the last. At 1700 hours, as darkness began to fall on what had been the longest day of their lives, Hendricks heard a new sound, different from the artillery and small arms fire that had been the soundtrack of the battle. Tank engines. But these were American tank engines, the distinctive rumble of Sherman tanks, and they were getting closer. Through the gathering gloom he saw them, an entire armored company supported by infantry, American forces driving north into what should have been German-controlled territory. The Germans, already shaken by the air attack and exhausted from hours of costly combat, broke contact and began a fighting withdrawal as they suddenly found themselves facing not a surrounded platoon, but the vanguard of a genuine American counterattack. The siege of Rockrath was over. The relief force arrived at the village at 1730 hours, and what they found shocked even these combat-hardened veterans. 16 American soldiers, most of them wounded, all of them pushed beyond any reasonable limit of human endurance, defending ruins that barely qualified as a village anymore. The bodies of more than 200 German soldiers scattered across the approaches and inside the village perimeter. 2 destroyed tanks, an immobilized tank, 3 destroyed half-tracks, and evidence of a sustained battle that should have been impossible for such a small force. The company commander, a captain who had seen his share of combat across Europe, approached Hendricks in the church basement where the lieutenant was sitting against a wall, too exhausted to even stand. "Lieutenant, I don't know what the hell you and your men did here today, but you need to know you just saved about 3,000 American lives. The line we've been trying to establish all day held because this regiment was stuck here instead of hitting our flank. We've identified them as 1st SS Panzer Division, elite troops who were supposed to be leading the breakthrough, and you held them off for 8 hours with 30 men. That's not just brave, son. That's something they're going to study in staff college for the next 100 years. Hendricks, too tired for false modesty or military protocol, just nodded and said, "We lost 14 men, sir. Good men. Make sure somebody remembers their names because this can't have been for nothing." The captain promised he would, though in the chaos of the battle and the subsequent months of combat, many of those names would indeed be lost to history. Soldiers who performed one of the most remarkable defensive actions of the war, but whose individual stories would fade into the general narrative of the Battle of the Bulge.
Lieutenant Hendricks would survive the war and return to his pre-war career as a high school teacher in Ohio, rarely speaking about Rockrath except to close friends and fellow veterans. He would attend some of the platoon reunions in later years, gatherings that grew smaller as the survivors aged and passed away, and in private conversations with his men, he would always say that December 18, 1944 was the day he learned what human beings are truly capable of when circumstances demand everything they have. Sergeant Torres would stay in the Army after the war, making it his career, and would eventually retire as a command sergeant major, training new generations of infantrymen and always using Rockrath as an example of what proper defensive tactics and sheer guts could accomplish against overwhelming odds. Corporal Washington would become a minister in Georgia, and in his sermons he would sometimes reference the lessons he learned about faith and courage in a Belgian village whose name most of his congregation had never heard. Private Chen would return to San Francisco and take over his family's restaurant, and he would hang a faded photograph of the platoon in a corner of the restaurant where he could see it every day, a reminder of the men he had served with and the extraordinary thing they had accomplished together. The other survivors would scatter across America, returning to farms and factories, offices and colleges, carrying with them memories of a day when they had been called upon to do the impossible and had somehow succeeded. Some would struggle with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress, the invisible wounds of sustained combat that 1940s medicine didn't understand or treat effectively. Some would thrive, using the confidence gained from surviving such an ordeal to tackle challenges in civilian life with the knowledge that nothing could be harder than what they had already endured. Some would remain close, maintaining friendships forged in the shared crucible of combat. Others would drift apart, finding it too painful to maintain connections that reminded them of friends who hadn't made it home. But all of them, whether they spoke of it publicly or kept it private, knew that they had been part of something extraordinary, a moment in history when ordinary men had achieved the extraordinary through courage, skill, and an unwillingness to surrender, even when every rational calculation said they should.
The Battle of the Bulge would continue for another month after Rochreth, eventually ending in German defeat and hastening the end of the war in Europe. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides would fight in that campaign, and the overall outcome would be determined by factors far larger than one platoon's stand at a crossroads village. But history turns on small hinges, on seemingly minor events that cascade into larger consequences. And the 8 hours that the Rochreth platoon bought for American forces to reorganize their defenses contributed to a successful outcome in ways that are impossible to fully quantify, but undeniably significant. The German regiment delayed at Rochreth wasn't available to exploit weaknesses elsewhere. The American units that gained time to establish defensive positions because of that delay were able to hold critical ground. The psychological impact of encountering fierce resistance rippled through German command structures, reinforcing concerns that the offensive was losing momentum. None of these effects were decisive in themselves, but warfare is cumulative, a complex interaction of countless individual actions and decisions that add up to strategic outcomes. If you've made it this far in this incredible story, you're exactly the kind of viewer we create content for. And we'd be honored if you'd subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the untold stories of World War II. Drop a comment below telling us what aspect of this story impressed you most. Was it the tactical brilliance of Lieutenant Hendricks, the marksmanship of Corporal Washington, the determination of all 30 men to stand and fight despite the odds, or something else entirely? And please, share this video with anyone you know who appreciates real history and the stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, because these stories deserve to be remembered and honored. The legacy of Rochreth lives on in unexpected ways. The village was rebuilt after the war, and today it's a quiet Belgian community that shows little sign of the desperate battle fought in its streets. But there is a small memorial erected in the 1990s after researchers uncovered the full story of the American platoon's stand that honors both the Americans who defended the village and the civilians who suffered through the battle. Some of the veterans returned to Rochreth in later years, emotional journeys to the place where they had faced death and somehow survived, and they were always received with gratitude by the Belgian locals who understood that the blood spilled in their village in December 1944 had contributed to their liberation. The lessons of Rochreth are taught at military academies when studying defensive tactics, small unit leadership, and the psychological factors that enable small forces to successfully delay much larger enemies. The combination of terrain usage, fire discipline, tactical deception, and sheer determination displayed by Hendricks and his platoon has become a case study in how to maximize limited resources against superior numbers. But perhaps the most important legacy is the reminder that history is made not just by generals and politicians making grand strategic decisions, but by ordinary soldiers facing impossible situations
and choosing courage over surrender, duty over survival. The 30 men who held Rosheroth didn't know they were making history. They weren't thinking about legacy or how future generations would remember them. They were simply trying to survive the next hour, the next attack, the next moment in a battle that seemed endless. They made mistakes, experienced fear, felt despair, and yet they continued fighting because that's what their training, their loyalty to each other, and their sense of duty demanded. That human element, the gap between what people think they're capable of and what they actually achieve when circumstances demand it, is what makes stories like Rosheroth so powerful and so important to remember. In the decades after World War II, as the veterans aged and their numbers dwindled, there was a race against time to record their stories before they were lost forever. Historians, journalists, and filmmakers conducted interviews, collected documents, and pieced together narratives of battles both famous and obscure. Rosheroth fell somewhere in between, significant enough to warrant mention in detailed histories of the Battle of the Bulge, but not as famous as Bastogne or other headline-grabbing actions. The full story of what the platoon accomplished remained fragmentary until the 1990s, when a combination of declassified German documents, American after-action reports, and interviews with survivors allowed researchers to reconstruct the battle in detail. What emerged was a picture of combat that was both more brutal and more remarkable than the brief official accounts had suggested. A genuine David versus Goliath story that deserved to be more widely known. The question that historians and military analysts still debate is whether Hendricks made the right decision. By any conventional calculation, attempting to hold Rosheroth with 30 men against a German regiment was tactically unsound, likely to result in the complete loss of the platoon with minimal impact on the broader battle. A retreat through the forest, while risky, would have preserved the force for future operations and avoided the 14 deaths that resulted from the stand. But Hendricks had information and intuition that suggested the crossroads was more important than it appeared, and he made a battlefield decision that prioritized mission accomplishment over force preservation. The fact that his gamble paid off, that the delay his platoon imposed had strategic significance, validates his decision in retrospect. But at the moment he made it, he was accepting odds that would normally be considered unacceptable. That tension between by-the-book military logic and battlefield intuition is at the heart of military leadership. And Rosheroth stands as an example of when breaking the rules and trusting instinct produced extraordinary results.
For the German soldiers who fought at Rosheroth, the battle was a frustrating and costly delay that contributed to the failure of their offensive. The regiment that attacked the village suffered casualties that, while not crippling, were significant enough to reduce its combat effectiveness at a time when every soldier and every hour mattered. The psychological impact was perhaps even more significant, as troops who had been advancing rapidly through collapsing American defenses suddenly encountered fierce resistance that suggested the Americans were more organized and determined than intelligence had indicated. That uncertainty, that sense that the easy victories were over, and that every American position might be as stubbornly defended as Rosheroth, contributed to a cautiousness in subsequent operations that slowed the German advance at a critical moment. War is as much about psychology as it is about bullets and bombs, and the 30 Americans at Rosheroth won a psychological victory far out of proportion to their numbers. The broader context of the Battle of the Bulge helps explain why Rosheroth mattered so much, despite being a small action in a large campaign. The German offensive was a desperate gamble, an attempt to split Allied forces, capture critical supply depots, and potentially force a negotiated peace that would allow Germany to concentrate on the Eastern Front. The plan required speed, momentum, and achieving objectives before Allied numerical and material superiority could be brought to bear. Every delay, every unexpected pocket of resistance, every hour spent fighting for a crossroads that should have been taken without opposition was time lost that couldn't be recovered. The German offensive would ultimately fail for many reasons, including weather that initially grounded Allied aircraft, supply problems, fuel shortages, and the eventual Allied response once the initial surprise wore off. But in the first critical days, when momentum mattered most, actions like the defense of Rosheroth helped slow the German advance just enough to prevent them from achieving their operational objectives before Allied reinforcements could arrive.
The human cost of Rosheroth is impossible to calculate with precision. 14 Americans died in the battle, and their families received telegrams informing them of the loss, joining thousands of other American families who received similar news during the winter of 1944-1945. Each of those men had stories, dreams, people who loved them, futures that were cut short in a Belgian village most Americans had never heard of. The wounded carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The survivors dealt with guilt, memories, nightmares, and the complex emotions that come from surviving when comrades didn't. On the German side, estimates suggest more than 200 casualties. Each of those men also someone's son or brother or father, fighting for a cause that history would judge harshly, but which they believed in, or at least felt duty-bound to serve. War creates these tragedies on a massive scale. And while we can analyze tactics and strategy, celebrate courage and honor sacrifice, we should never lose sight of the individual human cost of every battle. As we come to the end of this remarkable story, I want you to take a moment to reflect on what these 30 men accomplished and what it means for us today. We live in an era where the World War II generation is almost entirely gone, where the battles they fought are becoming history rather than living memory, and where the lessons they taught through their sacrifice risk being forgotten. The defense of Rosheroth isn't just a cool military story or an interesting tactical case study. It's a reminder that ordinary people, when called upon, are capable of extraordinary courage, and that the freedom and peace we enjoy today were purchased at tremendous cost by men and women who simply did their duty, regardless of the personal price. If this story moved you, if it made you think about courage and sacrifice and what it means to stand up when everything seems hopeless, then please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others who need to hear these stories. Leave a comment telling us what you think about the actions of Lieutenant Hendricks and his platoon, and let us know what other untold World War II stories you'd like us to cover. These men deserve to be remembered, and by watching, sharing, and engaging with content like this, you're helping ensure their legacy lives on for future generations who need to understand the price of freedom and the depth of human courage when circumstances demand everything we have to give.